Holy shit. Where do I even start with this nightmare? My 2-year-old son Jake started coming home from Bright Horizons daycare in Austin, Texas with weird scratches and bite marks all over his arms and legs. At first, I thought it was just normal toddler stuff. You know how kids that age are? They bite and scratch each other constantly, right? Wrong. So fucking wrong. It started about 3 months ago when Jake began having these insane meltdowns every single morning when I tried to drop him off. This kid used to love daycare, would run straight to the toy box without even saying bye to me. He'd be so excited to see his friends and teachers that he'd practically jump out of my arms. But suddenly, he's clinging to my leg like his life depends on it, screaming no school at the top of his lungs while tears poured down his face. The teachers, Miss Sarah and Miss Brittany, kept telling me it was just a phase and that separation anxiety was totally normal for his age. Miss Sarah had been there for like 8 years and seemed really experienced, always knew exactly what to say to calm upset parents down. But Miss Brittany was new, maybe 4 months in. She was probably early 20s, always looked exhausted like she'd been up all night partying, and had this weird way of talking to the kids that felt off. Like she'd get right in their faces and whisper things I couldn't quite hear when I was picking Jake up. Sometimes I'd catch her with this strange smile while watching the kids play, like she was enjoying something the rest of us couldn't see. The scratches and bite marks kept getting worse. I'm talking deep scratches that looked intentional, not accidental playground stuff. Some of them were in perfect parallel lines, like someone had dragged their fingernails across his skin deliberately. And the bite marks? They were way too big to be from another toddler, with distinct adult-sized teeth impressions. I started taking photos every day when I got Jake home, and noticed they were always in places his clothes would cover. Upper arms, back, stomach area, inner thighs. Places where nobody would see unless they were looking for them. When I asked Jake what happened, he'd just say, "Brittany mad," and pretend to bite his own arm while making angry faces. My stomach dropped because this kid could barely put 2 words together most of the time, but Brittany mad came out clear as day every single time I asked. He'd also started doing this thing where he'd curl up in a ball and rock back and forth whenever I mentioned school. I knew something was seriously fucked up, but I kept second-guessing myself because everyone kept telling me I was overreacting. I marched into that daycare the next morning and demanded to speak with the director, Mrs. Coleman. She looked at the photos on my phone and immediately went into damage control mode, started saying things like, "Children that age have very active imaginations, and sometimes they give themselves marks during tantrums. And you know how rough toddlers can be with each other." The way she dismissed my concerns so quickly made me want to punch something. She kept looking at her watch like I was wasting her time and interrupting more important business. I asked to see the classroom security footage, and she got all defensive, saying their cameras were only for safety purposes, and parents couldn't view them without going through proper legal channels. She kept emphasizing that both teachers had clean background checks and early childhood education degrees, like that somehow made abuse impossible. When I pushed harder about the bite marks clearly being too big for a toddler, she actually suggested that maybe Jake was biting himself for attention because of changes at home. What the actual fuck? That afternoon, I took Jake straight to his pediatrician, Dr. Martinez, who took one look at the marks and said, "These are adult bite marks. No question about it." She had me undress Jake completely and documented every single mark with photos and measurements. There were way more than I'd realized. Bruises on his ribs, scratches on his back, finger-shaped marks on his arms. She said she was legally required to contact CPS immediately and asked if I wanted her to call the police as well. The bite marks had a distinct pattern that matched adult dental impressions, and some of the scratches showed fingernail patterns consistent with an adult hand. Dr. Martinez also noticed that Jake seemed unusually withdrawn during the exam and kept flinching when she tried to touch his arms or back. He wouldn't make eye contact and kept asking, "Jake in trouble?" over and over. She said his behavioral changes combined with the physical evidence painted a clear picture of systematic abuse. Dr. Martinez also noticed something else that made my blood run cold. Jake had what looked like rope burns around his wrists and ankles. When she asked him about them, he said, "Brittany tied Jake up when Jake cried." I felt like I was going to throw up right there in the examination room. This monster had been restraining my baby when he got upset instead of comforting him. The CPS investigator, Linda Thompson, came to our house that same evening. She was actually really good with Jake, used these special dolls and toys to help him communicate what was happening. He immediately showed her how Brittany hurt Jake by making the doll bite and scratch the stuffed animal. He also showed her how Brittany would grab his arms and shake him when he cried, and how she would tie his hands behind his back during nap time. But the worst part was when Jake used the dolls to show how Brittany would put tape over kids' mouths when they were crying or screaming. He demonstrated putting tape over the doll's mouth and then making it rock back and forth silently. Linda's face went white as she documented everything Jake showed her. She said she'd seen a lot of abuse cases, but this level of calculated cruelty toward toddlers was particularly disturbing. Linda documented everything and said she'd be conducting surprise visits to the daycare, but warned me these investigations can take weeks or even months to build a proper case. She also said I should consider finding alternative childcare immediately if possible, which made me want to scream, because there's literally a 6-month waiting list for every decent daycare in Austin. She gave me her direct number and said to call immediately if Jake showed any new injuries or disclosed additional information. I started calling other parents from Jake's class, and holy shit, I wasn't alone. This mom, Jennifer, said her daughter Mia had been coming home with mysterious bruises for weeks. She'd been taking photos too, and when she showed them to me, they looked exactly like Jake's injuries. Finger-shaped bruises, bite marks, scratches in deliberate patterns. Another dad, Marcus, told me his son Tyler had started hitting other kids and having violent outbursts, which was completely out of character. A mom named Amy mentioned her daughter had suddenly become terrified of bath time and would scream if anyone tried to wash her hair. But here's the really fucked up part. Jennifer said she'd complained to Mrs. Coleman about the bruises 3 weeks ago and was told that Mia was probably just clumsy and accident-prone. Marcus had been told that Tyler's aggression was normal developmental behavior, and he should consider whether there was violence at home that Tyler might be copying. Amy was told her daughter's bath time issues were probably just a phase, and she should try making it more fun with toys and bubbles. They were gaslighting all of us into thinking we were imagining problems or causing them ourselves. The pattern was so obvious once we started comparing notes. Dismiss the parents' concerns, blame the children's behavior on home situations, make us feel like we were crazy or bad parents for questioning what was happening. We all met up at a Starbucks on South Lamar to compare notes, and it was like a horror movie. Every single one of our kids had started showing weird behavioral changes around the same time, about 2 months after Miss Brittany started working there. Jennifer showed us photos of handprint-shaped bruises on Mia's legs and what looked like scratch marks on her back. Marcus said Tyler had been waking up screaming every night for a month, and when he asked Tyler about his dreams, Tyler would just say, "Mean teacher hurt Tyler." Amy's daughter had started hoarding food in her room and would hide under her bed when it was time to get ready for daycare. She'd also started speaking in whispers and would flinch whenever an adult raised their voice, even slightly. All of our kids had stopped talking about school entirely, which was weird because toddlers usually can't shut up about their daily activities. The more we talked, the more obvious it became that something seriously fucked up was happening in that toddler room. Amy mentioned she'd complained to Miss Sarah about her daughter's sudden aggression, and Sarah had just shrugged and said, "Terrible twos. What can you do?" None of the staff seemed concerned about multiple children suddenly developing behavioral problems at the exact same time. Jennifer said she'd asked Miss Brittany directly about Mia's bruises, and Brittany had gotten defensive, saying, "Kids bruise easily when they play rough," while avoiding eye contact. Marcus had the most disturbing story. He said he'd arrived early for pickup one day and heard children screaming from the toddler room. When he walked in, Miss Brittany was standing over a group of kids who were sitting on the floor with their hands behind their backs, completely silent. She claimed they were playing a quiet game, but Marcus said the kids looked terrified. Tyler had wet himself and was sitting in it, too scared to ask for help. Here's where I probably did something illegal, but I don't give a shit. I started hiding a small voice recorder in Jake's diaper bag every morning. The recorder had a 12-hour battery life and could pick up conversations from across the room. On the first day, I got nothing useful. Just normal daycare sounds, kids playing, teachers giving instructions. But on the 4th day, I hit the jackpot. The recording clearly caught Miss Brittany saying, "Shut the fuck up, or I'll give you something to really cry about," followed by the sound of a child screaming in pain. You could hear Jake's voice saying, "No bite, no bite," in that terrified whisper he'd started using, and her responding, "Maybe next time you'll listen when I tell you to sit down, you little brat." But that wasn't even the worst part. The audio also captured her telling another kid, "Nobody will believe you if you tell your mommy, so don't even try. Your parents send you here because they don't want to deal with you." There was also this really disturbing part where she was making these weird cooing sounds while a child was crying, like she was enjoying their distress. She kept saying things like, "Does that hurt? Good. Maybe you'll remember this next time." The recording also caught her forcing kids to eat food off the floor after they dropped it, calling them disgusting little animals and making them bark like dogs. She made one kid stand in a corner for over an hour without moving while the other children played. If the kid in the corner moved at all, she'd restart the timer and add more time. The whole thing was about 45 minutes of pure psychological and physical torture. I called the other parents immediately, and we all met at my house that night. When I played the recording, Jennifer started sobbing and had to leave the room. Marcus looked like he wanted to murder someone and kept pacing around my living room, punching his palm and muttering about what he wanted to do to Brittany. Amy was remarkably calm, but in that scary way where you know someone is about to snap and do something crazy. We decided we needed more evidence before going to the police because we knew they'd want proof beyond just one recording. Jennifer volunteered to hide a camera in Mia's backpack, and Marcus said he'd start showing up at random times for pickup to see if he could catch anything suspicious. Amy suggested we all start keeping detailed logs of every mark, bruise, and behavioral change we noticed in our kids, but I couldn't wait. The next morning, I went straight to the Austin Police Department and met with Detective Rodriguez. He listened to the recording twice and said it was definitely concerning, but audio evidence alone might not be enough for criminal charges, because a good defense attorney could argue it was taken out of context. He said he'd coordinate with CPS to get a warrant for the daycare's security footage and possibly set up surveillance. The detective also warned us that even if they arrested Brittany, the case could take months or even years to go to trial, and conviction rates for child abuse cases are disappointingly low. He suggested we document everything we could and try to find alternative childcare for our kids as soon as possible. Easy for him to say. Did he have any idea how impossible it is to find decent daycare in Austin with less than 6 months' notice? Detective Rodriguez also told me something that made my skin crawl. He said they'd had complaints about Bright Horizons before, going back almost 2 years. Parents had reported similar issues: unexplained injuries, behavioral changes, kids being afraid of specific teachers. But the complaints never had enough evidence to pursue criminal charges, and CPS investigations kept getting closed due to insufficient evidence. I couldn't afford to quit my job, and my husband worked construction with no flexibility for time off. We were making barely enough to cover our mortgage and Jake's daycare costs as it was. We were completely trapped between protecting our kid and keeping the income we needed to survive. Every morning I dropped Jake off at that place felt like I was feeding him to wolves. But what choice did I have? The next morning, I'm sitting in my car in the daycare parking lot trying to work up the courage to take Jake inside when 3 police cars and a CPS van pull up. I watched through the front windows as they separated all the staff into different rooms and started interviewing them one by one. Parents showing up for drop-off were being turned away by an officer who said the facility was temporarily closed for investigation. Miss Brittany tried to leave through the back door when she saw the police cars, but they were waiting for her. I watched them put her in handcuffs and walk her to a patrol car while she kept shaking her head and crying crocodile tears. She looked directly at me sitting in my car and gave me this look of pure hatred, like she knew I was responsible for her getting caught. Miss Sarah was also detained, though she wasn't arrested immediately. Mrs. Coleman came out of the building in handcuffs about 20 minutes later, screaming that this was all a misunderstanding and she was going to sue everyone involved. She spotted me in the parking lot and started yelling that I was a vindictive parent trying to destroy her business because I was mentally unstable. The cops had to physically restrain her from approaching my car. Detective Rodriguez called me that afternoon with an update that made me physically sick. The security footage was even worse than we'd imagined. They found video of Brittany biting children hard enough to leave marks, scratching them with her fingernails until they bled, and forcing them to sit in their own soiled diapers for hours as punishment. There was also footage of her holding kids underwater during bath time until they stopped struggling, then pulling them up just before they passed out. One particularly horrifying clip showed her picking up a crying toddler and slamming them down in a crib so hard the kid bounced and hit their head on the side rail. Another showed her putting tape over multiple children's mouths during nap time and leaving them tied to their cots for hours. The detective said they found over 50 separate incidents of abuse on the security footage spanning the 4 months she'd been working there. But here's the part that really fucked me up. The footage also showed Miss Sarah witnessing several of these incidents and doing absolutely nothing to stop them. In some clips, you could see her looking directly at Brittany abusing children and just walking away like it was none of her business. She even helped restrain kids a few times when they tried to run away from Brittany. The detective also told me they found a notebook in Brittany's locker with detailed notes about each child's triggers and how to break them. She had written things like Jake cries when separated from comfort item, hide blanket to increase distress, and Mia responds to physical intimidation, use grabbing and shaking to establish dominance. It was like a fucking instruction manual for psychological torture. Brittany was arrested on multiple charges of child abuse, assault, endangerment, and unlawful restraint. Her bail was set at $500,000, and she couldn't make it, so she sat in county jail awaiting trial. Miss Sarah was charged with failure to report child abuse and child endangerment for her role in enabling the abuse. Mrs. Coleman was hit with criminal negligence, operating an unsafe childcare facility, and conspiracy charges. The whole thing made the local news within 48 hours, then went national when footage leaked showing the extent of the abuse. Daycare teacher systematically tortures toddlers was the headline, and suddenly our quiet neighborhood scandal was front-page news across the country. Reporters were calling my phone constantly, camping out in the daycare parking lot and trying to interview other parents at grocery stores and playgrounds. My boss was initially understanding about me missing work for police interviews and court proceedings, but after a week, she pulled me aside and said I needed to get my personal life sorted out because it was affecting my productivity. She actually suggested I consider taking unpaid leave until everything blew over because my situation was making other employees uncomfortable. 3 other parents in our group got similar warnings or outright threats from their employers. The preliminary hearing was a complete shit show. Brittany's defense attorney tried to claim the security footage was taken out of context and that she was just using firm but appropriate discipline techniques for difficult children. He painted her as an overwhelmed young woman trying her best with a room full of behaviorally challenging toddlers whose parents had failed to teach them proper behavior. This piece of shit lawyer actually argued that the children had been asking for it by being disruptive, and that Brittany's actions were within the realm of reasonable discipline. He claimed the bite marks were from other children, the restraints were safety measures to prevent self-harm, and the psychological abuse was actually therapeutic intervention to help the children learn self-control. The prosecutor, Maria Gonzalez, wasn't having any of that bullshit. She played clip after clip of Brittany clearly abusing defenseless children while they screamed and tried to get away. She showed the jury Brittany's notebook with the detailed torture plans and read some of the most disturbing entries out loud. The judge looked physically sick watching some of the footage and denied Brittany's request for reduced bail. Jake had to be evaluated by a child psychologist, Dr. Patricia Lee, who specialized in trauma cases involving very young children. She used play therapy and art activities to help him process what had happened and prepare for potentially having to testify. Jake drew pictures of mean lady hurt Jake that broke my fucking heart. Stick figures with huge mouths full of teeth, children tied up with rope, kids with tape over their mouths. Dr. Lee said Jake was showing classic signs of severe PTSD, nightmares, regression in potty training and speech development, aggressive behavior toward other children, extreme anxiety around female caregivers, and something called learned helplessness, where he would just go limp and stop fighting when he thought he was in trouble. She recommended intensive therapy multiple times a week and warned that the effects could last for years or even permanently alter his development if not properly addressed. The evaluation also revealed that Jake had developed several trauma responses that could affect him for life. He'd started dissociating during stressful situations, essentially mentally checking out when things got overwhelming. He'd also developed hypervigilance, constantly scanning environments for potential threats. Dr. Lee said these were survival mechanisms his brain had developed to cope with systematic abuse. The daycare's insurance company immediately canceled their policy once the criminal charges were filed, leaving Mrs. Coleman to hire her own attorney. She tried to claim she had no knowledge of the abuse and painted herself as another victim who'd been deceived by a manipulative employee. Her lawyer argued that she couldn't be held responsible for the actions of one bad teacher, and that she'd followed all state regulations for hiring and supervision. But the prosecution had evidence that Mrs. Coleman had received numerous complaints from parents over the months and had actively covered them up. They found emails where she instructed staff to give standard responses to parent concerns and to redirect blame back to the families whenever possible. She'd also falsified inspection reports and hidden documentation of previous incidents. Meanwhile, I was drowning in legal fees and therapy costs that insurance wouldn't cover. Jake's sessions with Dr. Lee were $200 each, 3 times a week, and our insurance considered it experimental treatment, so they wouldn't pay for it. My husband had to take a second job doing weekend construction and evening handyman work to help pay for everything. We maxed out 5 credit cards, took out a loan against our car, and borrowed money from my parents. The financial stress was destroying our marriage. My husband started blaming me for overreacting and said I should have just pulled Jake out quietly instead of making a federal case out of it. He couldn't understand why I couldn't just let it go and move on. We were fighting constantly about money, about time spent on court proceedings, about whether Jake really needed all the therapy he was getting. The state licensing board shut down Bright Horizons permanently and fined the parent company $200,000. They found multiple violations, including inadequate supervision, failure to report incidents, employing staff who hadn't completed required training, falsifying safety records, and operating without proper insurance coverage. The company immediately filed for bankruptcy to avoid paying the fine or any civil settlements. But here's the really fucked up part. The parent company just opened a new daycare, 3 towns over under a different name. Same owners, same management structure, probably some of the same staff who hadn't been directly implicated. The licensing board couldn't stop them because technically it was a new business with no history of violations. 6 months later, Brittany's trial finally started. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence, security footage, medical documentation, testimony from multiple children and parents, plus the audio recording I'd made and the torture notebook. Her defense team tried to argue she had untreated mental health issues and didn't understand her actions were wrong. They brought in psychiatrists who testified that Brittany had borderline personality disorder and childhood trauma that made her unable to control her impulses around children. They claimed she was basically mentally ill and needed treatment, not punishment. It was complete bullshit, designed to get sympathy from the jury and reduce her sentence. The trial lasted 3 weeks and was covered extensively by local and national media. Every day, there were protesters outside the courthouse, some supporting the families, others claiming we were trying to destroy an innocent woman's life. The coverage was intense and often intrusive, with reporters trying to interview Jake and the other young children involved. Jake had to testify, which was the worst day of my life. They set up a closed-circuit TV system so he could talk to the prosecutor from a separate room without seeing Brittany. But even that was traumatic for him. Watching my 2-year-old explain to strangers how his teacher hurt him made me want to burn the whole fucking world down. The prosecutor was gentle with Jake, using toys and pictures to help him communicate what had happened. But Jake kept shutting down and going nonverbal whenever they asked about specific incidents. He'd curl up in a ball and rock back and forth, or just stare blankly at the wall. It took hours, spread across multiple sessions, to get his full testimony. The defense attorney tried to cross-examine Jake, which should have been illegal, in my opinion. He kept asking leading questions designed to confuse a toddler and make it seem like Jake was making things up. He'd ask things like, "Are you sure it was Miss Brittany who hurt you? Could it have been someone else? Could you have hurt yourself?" Jake started crying and asking for me, but they wouldn't let me comfort him during testimony. The jury took less than 3 hours to find Brittany guilty on all charges. She was sentenced to 15 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for the first 8 years. Mrs. Coleman got 5 years for criminal negligence and conspiracy and was permanently banned from working with children. Miss Sarah got 2 years of probation and 500 hours of community service. But you know what really pissed me off? Brittany showed no remorse whatsoever during sentencing. When the judge asked if she had anything to say to the families, she stood up and said, "We had ruined her life over normal disciplinary actions, and that our children were out of control and needed firm guidance." She actually blamed us for pressing charges and said she hoped we could live with ourselves for destroying an innocent person. The civil lawsuit against the daycare corporation took another 3 years to resolve. They hid assets, claimed bankruptcy multiple times, transferred ownership to shell companies, and dragged out every legal procedure possible. Their lawyers filed motion after motion trying to get the case dismissed or moved to different jurisdictions. We eventually settled for $50,000 per family, which didn't even cover half our legal expenses and therapy costs. Meanwhile, Jake continued therapy with Dr. Lee for over 2 years and still sees a counselor monthly at age 5. He's made incredible progress but still has nightmares sometimes and gets anxious around new caregivers. His speech development was delayed by almost a year due to the trauma, and he needed intensive speech therapy to catch up. He also developed selective mutism and would go completely nonverbal in stressful situations. The trauma affected every aspect of Jake's development. His motor skills were delayed because he'd learned to be hyper-aware of his surroundings instead of focusing on normal developmental activities. His social skills suffered because he'd learned not to trust adults or form attachments. Even his eating was affected. He'd hoard food and eat incredibly fast, like someone might take it away from him. Finding new childcare after this experience was incredibly difficult. I interviewed dozens of providers and eliminated most of them for minor red flags that probably meant nothing. The trauma made me hypervigilant and suspicious of anyone who wanted to care for Jake. I installed nanny cams, did extensive background checks, and showed up for surprise visits constantly. I eventually found a small family daycare run by a woman whose own kids attended there. The owner, Mrs. Rodriguez, had been operating for 25 years with references from hundreds of families. Most importantly, they had an open-door policy where parents could visit or call anytime without notice. They also had cameras in every room that parents could access through an app, and all staff wore body cameras during work hours. The other families from our support group stayed in close contact through a private Facebook group where we shared updates about our kids' recovery, therapy recommendations, and warnings about other questionable childcare providers in the area. We became like a trauma family, bonded by this horrible shared experience that nobody else could really understand. Jennifer became a fierce advocate for stronger daycare oversight and testified before the Texas state legislature about needed reforms. She helped pass legislation requiring cameras in all childcare facilities, mandatory reporting training for all staff, and stricter background check requirements. Marcus started a nonprofit organization that provides free legal and psychological services to families dealing with institutional child abuse. Amy took a different approach and started homeschooling her daughter while working part-time from home. She said she couldn't trust anyone else with her child after what happened and didn't think she ever would. Her marriage ended up falling apart too because her husband thought she was being overprotective and paranoid. 2 years after the arrest, I got a letter saying Brittany was eligible for early release due to prison overcrowding and good behavior. The notification allowed victims to submit impact statements for the parole board. So I wrote a detailed 10-page letter about how her abuse continued to affect Jake's development and our family's finances and emotional well-being. I attended the parole hearing with Jennifer and Marcus to testify about Jake's ongoing therapy, his trust issues with caregivers, the debt we'd accumulated from legal and medical costs, and the ways this trauma had changed our entire family structure. The other parents also testified about their children's continued struggles with PTSD, developmental delays, and behavioral problems. Brittany looked different after 2 years in prison, thinner, graying hair, harder face, but she still showed zero remorse for what she'd done to our children. When asked if she had anything to say to the families, she claimed she was the real victim and that we had destroyed her life with false accusations. She said she'd learned nothing except that some people will believe anything children say. The parole board deliberated for less than an hour before denying her early release, stating she hadn't shown genuine remorse or acceptance of responsibility for her crimes. They said her continued denial and victim blaming demonstrated that she posed an ongoing threat to children and couldn't be safely released into the community. Jake is now 6 years old and thriving in first grade, though he still sees his counselor regularly and probably always will. He's developed into an incredibly empathetic kid who notices when other children seem scared or upset and goes out of his way to comfort them. His teacher says he has an unusual ability to recognize when classmates are having difficulties and often serves as a peer mediator during conflicts. But the trauma is still there under the surface. Jake still has nightmares sometimes, still flinches when adults raise their voices, still needs extra reassurance when trying new things or meeting new people. He's developed coping strategies and knows how to ask for help when he's feeling overwhelmed, but the hypervigilance and anxiety are probably permanent parts of his personality now. The whole experience taught me to trust my parental instincts, no matter what authority figures say. It also showed me how vulnerable our children are in institutional settings, and how important it is to advocate aggressively and persistently for their safety, even when everyone is telling you you're overreacting or imagining problems. I still drive past the old daycare building sometimes, now converted into a medical office complex. There's no sign of what happened there, no memorial for the children who were traumatized within those walls. But every parent in our neighborhood knows the story, and many have thanked me for speaking up when I noticed something was wrong. The financial impact lasted for years, and honestly, we're still recovering. We accumulated over $60,000 in debt from legal fees, therapy costs, and lost wages from missed work. My credit score tanked, making it impossible to qualify for better interest rates, refinance our mortgage, or get approved for any new loans. We had to sell our car and buy a used one, move to a smaller apartment, and completely change our lifestyle. But Jake's recovery and safety were worth every sacrifice. Looking back, I'm grateful he was young enough to heal with proper intervention and support. Some of the older children who testified continue to struggle with behavioral problems, trust issues, and developmental delays that affect their school performance and social relationships. The case led to significant changes in daycare regulations across Texas, including mandatory cameras in all classrooms, more frequent unannounced inspections, stricter background check and training requirements, and better procedures for investigating parent complaints. Local advocates informally nicknamed the legislation Jake's Law, though he doesn't know about that designation yet. I've been contacted by literally hundreds of other parents over the years who discovered similar situations at their children's daycare centers or schools. I always tell them to trust their instincts, document everything obsessively, get their child evaluated by medical and psychological professionals immediately, and never let administrators or authorities dismiss their concerns. The legal system moves incredibly slowly when it comes to child abuse cases, and the process is designed to protect defendants' rights rather than victims' well-being. We waited 8 months for arrests, then 2 years for trial and sentencing. During that whole time, our kids were dealing with trauma while we fought for justice and tried to rebuild their sense of safety and trust. Insurance companies and corporate lawyers will do absolutely everything possible to minimize their liability and financial exposure. They'll claim the abuse was an isolated incident by a rogue employee, not a systemic failure of supervision and oversight. They'll hire teams of lawyers and experts to discredit victims and their families. Don't let them get away with that narrative. Child abuse in institutional settings is way more common than people want to admit or acknowledge. Predators specifically seek out jobs that give them unsupervised access to vulnerable children. Daycare workers, teachers, coaches, youth counselors, any profession involving authority over kids attracts some seriously disturbed individuals who know how to manipulate the system. The cost of fighting for justice is absolutely enormous, financially, emotionally, professionally, and personally. We spent over $75,000 on legal fees, therapy, and medical expenses. I missed months of work for court appearances, meetings with lawyers and investigators, and Jake's therapy appointments. My marriage nearly fell apart from the stress and financial pressure. But what was the alternative? Let Brittany continue systematically torturing toddlers because it was easier than fighting the system? Pretend Jake's trauma wasn't real to avoid inconveniencing our employers or disrupting our comfortable life? Sometimes doing the right thing costs everything you have, and you do it anyway because children's safety is more important than anything else. Jake's story had a relatively good outcome because we caught the abuse early, had overwhelming evidence, and were able to afford proper legal representation and therapy. Many families aren't so lucky. Their children's reports are dismissed, evidence is ignored or suppressed, and abusers continue harming kids because institutions protect themselves first and children second. The ripple effects of this experience will probably last for the rest of our lives. Jake may struggle with trust issues, anxiety, and hypervigilance well into adulthood. Our family's financial stability was completely destroyed and took years to rebuild. Relationships with extended family members and friends were permanently damaged when some people questioned why we were making such a big deal about the situation. Social media was both incredibly helpful and incredibly harmful during this process. Our private parent support group was invaluable for sharing information, resources, and emotional support. But the public Facebook discussions and news comment sections devolved into victim blaming, conspiracy theories, and personal attacks that added significantly to our stress and trauma. Some people accused us of coaching our children, exaggerating their injuries for attention or money, or being vindictive parents trying to destroy an innocent woman's career. Others claimed we should have known something was wrong earlier and were negligent for not catching the abuse sooner. The judgment and criticism from other parents was almost as traumatic as the original abuse. I developed severe PTSD from this experience and still struggle with anxiety around childcare situations, authority figures, and institutional systems. I have intrusive thoughts about Jake being hurt whenever he's out of my sight. I've had panic attacks in grocery stores when I hear children crying. Therapy helped, but some psychological scars never fully heal. The media attention was definitely a double-edged sword. It helped pressure authorities to take action quickly and prevented the daycare from reopening under a different name or transferring problematic staff to other locations. But it also made our family a target for criticism, speculation, and unwanted attention. Jake's trauma became public entertainment for people who had no real stake in the outcome. Recovery from trauma is absolutely not linear, especially for young children. Jake would have good days where he seemed completely normal and happy, then suddenly regress and become terrified of things that had never bothered him before. We learned to celebrate small victories and not get discouraged by inevitable setbacks in the healing process. The other children in our support group all healed at different rates and in completely different ways. Some bounced back relatively quickly, while others needed years of intensive therapy and still struggle with the effects. There's no predicting how trauma will affect individual kids, how long recovery will take, or what the long-term consequences might be. I started a blog about recognizing signs of institutional child abuse that now gets thousands of views monthly from parents dealing with similar situations. The comment section is full of absolutely heartbreaking stories from families who discovered their children were being harmed by trusted caregivers, teachers, coaches, and other authority figures. Child Protective Services is completely overwhelmed and criminally underfunded in most states. Our caseworker Linda was fantastic, but she had over 60 active cases and couldn't give us the attention and follow-up our situation really deserved. The system is designed to react to crisis situations, not prevent abuse from happening in the first place. Mandatory reporting laws only work if people actually follow them and authorities take reports seriously. Multiple adults witnessed Brittany's systematic abuse and said nothing because they were more afraid of losing their jobs than protecting innocent children. That culture of institutional silence and self-protection enabled months of continued harm. The criminal justice system prioritizes proof beyond reasonable doubt, which is an incredibly high bar to meet in child abuse cases involving very young victims. Small children make unreliable witnesses, physical evidence is often minimal or ambiguous, and abusers are usually skilled at avoiding detection and manipulating situations to their advantage. I learned more about child development, trauma psychology, and the legal system than I ever wanted to know. Normal toddler behaviors like tantrums, aggression, and regression took on completely new significance after Jake's experience. Every behavioral change made me wonder if something terrible was happening that I wasn't seeing or understanding. The guilt of not protecting Jake better still haunts me sometimes, even though rationally I know I did everything I could with the information I had at the time. I should have trusted my instincts sooner. I should have pulled him out the first time I noticed unexplained injuries. I should have been more observant, asked better questions, pushed harder against institutional resistance. But Jake's therapist helped me understand that the guilt and blame belong entirely to the abuser, not the parent or victim. Brittany was the one who chose to systematically harm defenseless children for her own psychological gratification. The system failed to protect them through inadequate oversight and accountability. I did the best I could as a parent trying to balance work, childcare needs, and growing concerns. This experience made me a fierce advocate for children's rights, institutional accountability, and trauma-informed care. I volunteer with several organizations that work to prevent institutional abuse and support families dealing with similar situations. Turning our pain and trauma into purpose and advocacy has been an important part of the healing process for our entire family. Brittany will be eligible for parole again in 6 years, and I plan to attend every single hearing to make sure her victims' voices continue to be heard loud and clear. The prosecutor's office maintains regular contact with our family and has assured me they'll fight any attempts at early release until she serves her full sentence and demonstrates genuine remorse. Jake recently asked me why he has to go to a feelings doctor when his friends don't, so I explained in age-appropriate terms that a mean teacher hurt him when he was little, and the doctor helps him understand his feelings and feel safe again. He nodded seriously and said when he grows up, he wants to be a policeman so he can protect other kids from mean people who try to hurt them. This experience fundamentally changed how I view childcare institutions, authority figures, and the vulnerability of children in group settings. I volunteer regularly at Jake's school, maintain very close relationships with his teachers, and trust my instincts immediately when something feels off or concerning. If you made it through this entire nightmare of a story, thank you for reading and listening. Child abuse happens far more often than most people realize or want to acknowledge, and survivors need to know they're not alone in their experiences or their ongoing recovery process. The system will absolutely try to silence you, minimize your concerns, gaslight you into thinking you're overreacting, and protect institutions and authority figures over individual children and families. But your child's safety and well-being are worth fighting for, no matter how difficult, expensive, or emotionally devastating that fight becomes. Trust your parental instincts completely, and never stop advocating for your children, even when everyone around you is telling you to let it go or move on. Document everything obsessively, get professional evaluations immediately, and don't let anyone convince you that abuse is normal discipline or that your child's trauma isn't real or significant. If this story resonates with your own experiences, or if you have questions about recognizing signs of institutional abuse, please drop a comment below. These conversations are incredibly difficult, but absolutely necessary. Our children depend on adults who are willing to listen, believe them, and take action when something is wrong. Edit, holy shit, I didn't expect this to blow up like this. Thanks for all the support, shared stories, and resources people have been sharing in the comments. Reading your responses is both heartbreaking and encouraging. Heartbreaking because it shows how common this problem really is, but encouraging because it shows how many people care about protecting children. Update. Someone asked about Jake's current status and development. He's doing really well in first grade, and his nightmares have mostly stopped, though he still has occasional rough nights. His teacher says he's one of the kindest, most empathetic kids in his class, and always tries to help classmates who are upset or struggling. Trauma therapy absolutely works when you find the right therapist and stick with it long term. Second update. A few people have asked about the financial impact and whether it was worth it. We're still paying off debt from this whole ordeal, and probably will be for another few years. But absolutely yes, it was worth every penny and every sleepless night. Jake's safety and recovery were worth more than money or financial stability. You can't put a price on your child's well-being and future. Final edit. For everyone asking about legal advice or what to do if you suspect abuse, document everything with photos and detailed written notes. Get your child evaluated by medical and mental health professionals immediately. Don't let anyone gaslight you into thinking you're overreacting or imagining problems, and find a lawyer who specializes in child abuse cases. Your child's safety is worth more than anyone's comfort or convenience. Also, several people have asked about the current laws and regulations. Texas did pass stronger oversight requirements after our case, but enforcement is still inconsistent and underfunded. Many states still have inadequate protections for children in institutional settings. We need to keep pushing for better laws, better enforcement, and better training for people who work with kids.